Oh yes, pale blood. Huh. Well, you've come to the right place. Yharnam is the home of blood administration. You need only unravel its mystery. But where's an outsider like yourself to begin? Easy, with a bit of Yharnam blood of your own. But first, you'll need a contract. Good. All signed and sealed. Now, let's begin the transfusion. Oh, don't you worry. Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream.
Ah, you found yourself a hunter.
Prologue. Mr. Willem? Suddenly a voice had darkened his senses faster than he could perceive. How easy it can all slip away. To Willem, he had not been in the quaint office of the second floor of the public library. With eyes open, he had been enveloped by a dark abyss of dancing colors. A plane that was privy only to himself. An endless expanse where he could see things within his mind's eye. Fascinating ideas of truths. Truths almost so palpable he could reach out and grasp, to take them back with him to his quaint office. But it was a frail thing, and despite the immersion, when the voice pierced the space, he was suddenly caught sitting right back in his chair, where he had actually been the entire time. Now deprived of any inspiration, he irritatedly turned to the man in the door.
Yes? Do you have the time? A gentleman from Canehurst has arrived to discuss the transaction.
Aggravating as it was to be interrupted in his inspirational sessions, the news pardoned the offense. No more would his apparitions of truth be chased away, now that his reward had finally arrived. He stood up with vigor, along with a new cheerful mood in his voice.
Very good. I'll be down this very instant.
He passed the messenger hurriedly. The excitement made him take 2 steps at a time down the low-lit staircase leading to the lobby. He contained his manners as soon as his feet landed. The room was void of any employees. Present were only the apparent visitors from Canehurst's court. The group of 3 was evidently led by a man of slender build and of pale and sharp complexion, who distinguished himself from the 2 imposing but gallant guards by appearing more animate, albeit with a somewhat decrepit guise. The representative was in the midst of examining the surrounding in terror. Judging by his face, he appeared to take offense by what he was now inspecting.
Pardon,
I believe you are here on business concerning a property transaction. The noble's piercing white eyes slowly averted away from a bleak landscape painting onto Willem. He began approach with calm and graceful steps, yet the advance was horrifyingly quick.
Mr. Willem, the pleasure is mine to fulfill the will of the Majesty of Canehurst.
He spoke in a dark, gravelly voice, uttering each word with care. He bowed graciously.
Lord Wallace, our court doth marvels in thy work, the Thumerian line. What precious insight hath it bestowed upon us? The Majesty is well pleased, and showeth favour thereunto.
Willem was somewhat taken aback by the praise. With the nasty rumours in mind, he had dreaded the eventual meeting that the court had insisted on. He himself had been perfectly content with keeping the transactions to the letters. He thus found it difficult to find a sincere reaction to the unsuspected first encounter. Your compliments almost bring a tear to my eye, your lordship. I had no idea the full extent of my popularity at court. With a graceful gesture, he ushered the lord away from the lobby floor towards a side door. They entered a small room with superficial bookshelves and a lesser table with 2 chairs. The entourage took post outside as Willem and the noble walked inside, accompanied by a young boy who had gone unseen and hidden by the glamour of the guards.
Thou dost humble thyself, Master Willem. Thy presence would surely enrapture our court. Methinks Her Majesty might even conspire to extend thee an invitation.
The boy immediately was set to rapidly place various documents, quills and ink on the table as the 2 gentlemen sat themselves down.
I trust thou hast acquainted thyself with the contract, and the location as well.
Despite the neat layout, Lord Wallis could not help himself but correct their placement to his specific liking. Yes, I have been several times actually. It has been near impossible to keep myself from the place since I first visited. Luckily, my work keeps me occupied. His recount seemed to fall on deaf ears as the noble was completely immersed with the papers. To escape the dreadful silence of their first meeting, he fled into the images of his mind, the images of which he frequently visited, both on foot as well as within his own head. How he emerges from the forest and is greeted by the lake, seeing the hills in the distance over the water. He can clearly picture where the buildings will stand in the little lakeside clearing of the woods.
How delightful to hear.
The pale man stared gloomy-eyed at him, greedy for his full attention.
Anon thou shalt revel to thy heart's content.
He placed a long, rolled-out scroll in front of Willem.
Here is the document bearing witness to our relinquishing of the property unto thy name in exchange for the agreed sum. Find it herewith.
He pointed a bejeweled and bony finger at a corresponding paragraph as he spoke.
And signed with her illustrious hand.
The nail of the finger scraped lightly down the paper surface onto an overly ceremonious cursive signature, rendering it barely legible. Annalise, Queen of Castle Canehurst, and the ruling majesty of the Belua governance. He skimmed through the contents. Yes, I have nothing to add. Without a word, Valis withdrew the document and placed a new one in its stead.
The honor of Canehurst knoweth no bounds. Thy trust is well placed,
he said, with just a sprinkle of sinister undertone.
If thou dost wish to further investigate the legitimacy of our transcriptions, by all means. Yet thou surely knowest where to place thy signature.
He disregarded to appear as if actually reading the lengthy page, and directly grabbed the quill, not as much out of sincere trust as a desire to be rid of the insufferable mannerism of the noble. And there we have it. He was just able to finish his signature before the document was deftly swiped from under him.
Congratulations, Master Willem. Our dealings are concluded, and on behalf of the royal name, I, Lord Valis of the Canehurst Court, do here declare thee proprietor of Bergenworth.
When the mind is in gloom, the world tends to be influenced by this perception. Thus it was strange and aggravating that the day would so insist on blessing him with bountiful sunlight, instead of appropriate rain and fog. Many probably find themselves in a similar situation when the world around them takes little note of their bad fortune. With the birds chirping, it's hard to be sad. But whatever should one feel when the truth of one's actual say in life becomes dreadfully apparent? He considered leaving the foot of the great tree for his homestead. The cool shade in the sunlit farmscape did in fact leave a spot of cheeriness on his somber mood. Hey, here you are. What gives you such a face? An obnoxious, cheerful and carefree voice came from down the hill, approaching the shadow of the large tree. Looking up from where he lay, he saw the finely dressed silhouette of his friend, with his long black hair tied behind his head. I could say the same of you. What could ever be the cause of such a dung-eating grin? His friend stood over him in the shade, now visible with blinding light having left his face. He smiled, shook his head and crossed his arms. You are apparently having a bad day, German. So let me tell you. Lawrence sat down beside him. German in turn sat up against the root-cluttered foot of the tree. They had a complete view out over the fields and farmsteads, covering the plains made of green and yellow, of which the closest area being owned by German's own family. And further yet lay the silhouettes of the roofs and buildings of Yarnum. Here, the two have had many adventures growing up. One could tell on the small carvings in the oak, signifying every milestone of how far they could climb. And today, on a late summer day, just when the leaves would start to shift in color and the breeze began blowing gently colder, they still gathered as usual.
All right. I would love to hear about you,
German said, with a voice only Lawrence could tell to be a sarcastic one.
Oh, stop.
An envelope was hastily retrieved from Lawrence's inner pocket and given over.
Read for yourself.
He took it and pulled up the letter inside. It had been sealed with blue wax and stamped by an insignia of a manor house, behind which shone a moon. There was not much text, it all being centered on the paper under a large heading that informed the letter to be an admission result. It is with heartfelt pleasure that I, Willem, Provost of Bergenworth, can gleefully inform you of your acceptance to the newly established institution of learning this term. He stopped. The severe anxiety these past days had proved justified, and now they were further increased. Lawrence could just as well have punched him in the stomach. But they share every success, and so Lawrence's metaphorical strike would have been greeted with a smile and a pat on the back. But could anyone help feel any different after applying for the very same thing and failing?
What is the matter?
Lawrence retrieved the letter from German's limp grip. His expression must have been telling.
It's a while left for all the admissions to come out. No shame in celebrating early now. I didn't get in.
The rest of the sentence was lost in an involuntary murmur.
What? German?
Lawrence's grin had slowly faded, now being all gone.
Yes, I got the letter. But
you were not admitted. They sat for a while, steeping in their shared mood. From having so many ill-begotten thoughts, there suddenly was nothing in his head.
But
Lawrence began dumbfoundedly.
What now? This can't be.
German gave a defeated sigh and looked towards the barn.
Maybe I should just take over the farm. I always was more of a practical man than a scholar. Speak not like that. We agreed. We would do this.
Lawrence declared loudly and shot up from his seated place.
I simply won't have it. I can't accept it under these conditions. The luck to have only one of us, where the odds were in our favor.
He angrily articulated every word with flailing but controlled movements of his hands.
Your favor.
German managed to get out in the midst of the rant, but was ignored as Lawrence continued.
God's sake. At least one of us is in. Think positive now. What to do now? What to do?
He grew less frantic and stopped to stare down into the shaded grass. German continued to gaze out over the farms with a torn expression. Or it is the world telling us I should take a different path. The town could always use another carpenter. For a moment, the thought did not seem all that terrible. His own workshop, working at his own pace. Not such a terrible fate. You are delusional, German. I'll convince Willem myself, he proclaimed, turned on his heels, and stormed off. I'll not have you waste your talent. He will surely see it after some convincing. The voice grew fainter and further from him. The dull fantasy had him not fully alert to Lauren's radical plan. What? Oh, now? He took flight down the slope. What do you mean to say that could convince him? It's Willem. We would just be wasting our time. Lawrence, stop! Lawrence did slow down to a degree, so that he had the opportunity to catch up, but otherwise acted as if he had not heard him. This seems like an overreaction. What if we can't see him? He is a pretty occupied person. I just can't believe it, Lawrence muttered. After all the work, he still rejects you. He surely lacks some sort of knowledge about the extent of your character. Oh, but Lawrence, do you really suspect Willem capable of such mistakes? Of everyone, he surely knows best. Suddenly he stopped and turned to stare straight at him. What's gotten into you? Shape up. Stop being so persistently humble just this once and let's see this through. Had it been me who received the letter of rejection, nothing about this situation would be different, save for our places. German could not respond to it, for there was nothing to say. He had said it all. The green rolling hills, bountiful fields of cattle and grain, the hardened, broad dirt road became streets of cobble, houses standing wall to wall with another to line the streets, bustling sounds of people, both distant and near. The central square they came upon was one of several in Yarnam. Being as old as it was, they had all replaced one another through the ages as the new and relevant nucleus, now simply being part of an incredible mass. They all left their own shape of the footsteps through the town's history. Down the slope lay Old Yarnam, centered around the river flowing through the valley. From the top of the adjacent hill, they had view over the magnificent town. Were one to take a moment to observe the castle-like landscape, one could start to distinguish by architecture from where the town had started to grow, and subsequently make accurate guesses in which order the districts had emerged. Approaching the central library, Lawrence was forced to bring his noble assault to a more acceptable pace. Inside, the simple lobby was a room of rectangular construction. Windows gave light to both sides, ending with a wall against which a reception desk was placed, in between two large doorways, the left leading into a corridor, and the right a stairwell upwards. Dark oak wood and grey tapestry with vague patterns laced the walls, as per current Yarnam fashion. They casually approached the desk, now with a more synchronized pace. At the desk sat a husk of a woman who clearly had been with the establishment too long already, without any sort of positive diversion. She sat hunched over with her head pointed straight down into a book. Lawrence leaned against the desk and knocked charmingly. "Excuse me a moment, my lady, but could you be so kind as to tell me where Professor Willem's office is? If he is not in, He was startled into silence by the receptionist closing her book so fiercely it emitted a bang that echoed for a while in the dead lobby. Like a statue coming to life, she slowly lifted her head to look at Lawrence, took a deep breath, and in a single exhalation said,
Mr. Willem's office is the third door to the right up the stairs.
Her left hand rose and pointed with her thumb behind her at the doorway with the stairs. She returned to the book she had in front of her and, with another sigh, added,
Just read the signs.
Lawrence looked back at German stupefyingly and started walking towards the stair while muttering a thank you. The distance was made into a long journey as several scenarios played through German's head while ascending the stairs. How would they greet him? How direct should they be? Should they start with some small talk? By this point, Lawrence surely debated with himself if this currently was such a good idea as it appeared a while ago. At said door hung a looming sign telling them their fate could no longer be postponed. Professor Willem, as it read. Lawrence stood right in front of the door. He looked to be deep in anxious contemplation. Then he slightly shook his head and rapidly raised his arm to knock. The fist did, however, not manage to impact upon the wood, as the door opened up, with Professor Willem standing in its opening. The man on the other side would strike most as being too young for a professor, even more impressive due to the fact that this man was a future provost. He wore a velvet blue vest with matching, slightly darker blue pants and white shirt. He sported a rather dashing back comb to his plentiful brown hair. As he opened the door, he removed a pair of round reading glasses from his face. The silence that reigned over them as Willem's bewildered gaze met with both their empty stares was one that surfaces rarely. He looked to Lawrence's hand, which was still raised. "Good afternoon, lads." Willem broke the silence and continued in a tentative voice. "Is there anything I can help with?" Lawrence lowered his hand quickly. "Yes, Master Willem, if you have the time to spare." The professor's expression switched into a gentle-looking one. "Please." He waved dismissively. "If I am to spare you any time, Willem will suffice at the moment." "Well, thank you kindly. My name is Lawrence. It's a pleasure meeting you." He shook his hand and with a nod motioned them inside. "We have come to inquire about a certain rejected application to Bergenworth." "Oh, very well. If I recall correctly, you were admitted, Mr. Lawrence. So who will this inquiry concern?" Willem turned around and strolled on over towards one of the many bookshelves cladding the office walls. It instilled the impression that the man had too many books. Not that the office was uncommonly small, just that the man had crammed in his whole collection here, so there were no bare walls visible. "That would be me, Professor Willem. The name's German." Willem quickly glanced back at him, then turned to open a drawer with several documents neatly organized He folded through them until he found the one he sought. Yes. My boy, the answer is unfortunately very simple. You lack any significant education. He sat down at his desk after picking up a second document. German walked up and stood before him. Lawrence was quick to join.
But I've been here almost every day for the past year. You must have seen me yourself at your lectures.
You've attended every one. I'm aware. I recognized you as early as in the doorway. But I'm sorry to say that I require my students to have much experience from legitimate education. Like Lawrence here, he studied at a Brunhild University. That's quite a trip from here, and he has the diploma to prove it. He waved slightly with the second paper.
So you can attest to German's willingness and passion?
Lawrence remarked with a hint of frustration.
By now, you probably understand our reasoning for this visit.
I do indeed, Willem replied, indifferent to the boy's rising temper. And you two probably understand the reason why I can't go admitting just about anyone. We will be the spearhead of research, and although you will be students at Bergenworth, that entails much more than usual. As Lawrence crossed his arms, aimed his chin up and gazed downward, he appeared to have evolved into one of his stubborn episodes, appearing rather intimidating without raising too much alarm. But so did Willem.
All right, I understand. It was obvious Bergenworth was not just any institution. However, I find these diplomas as the sole qualification a bit hypocritical, pardon the expression. I wanted to examine who would be my new teacher, you see, and found very few with an appropriate background. I am utterly overwhelmed by the opportunity to learn from these wise and worldly men, although it seems now that my classmates might be the problem. All seemingly as stiff as I, from the long process of earning their education, unlike German here, who went another path. The professor's face remained unmoving, if not growing slightly colder. Do not discredit yourself and your kin. I am certain you and all of them had a struggle of their own to get here. But you do not disagree? Willem glared at Lawrence and finally nodded. Then he looked over at German. This is, after all, concerning you the most. Why is it that Lawrence here has such an exemplary record whilst you possess much lesser in comparison? It is my impression you do everything together. We do, sir. But we are of different skills.
He felt a rush of embarrassment and uncertainty in admitting the truth. But to his mind, truth had a way to prevail regardless.
I was never a great student.
Your hours here seem to say otherwise.
Not a great student in the common sense. I am terrible at following schedules and working assignments. I know it may sound arrogant, but it has always been my own way or no way.
He looked at him with a wavering gaze, thinking such a trait would worsen his case. but Willem only nodded indifferently. I understand. You do possess the base schooling. You must have been involved in your friend's studies. I was. We had constant letter exchanges. The professor drew in a pondering breath and looked fleetingly over at the shelves crowded with books. I never was agreeable back in school either. Sounding like speaking to himself, after a delay, he looked down at German's rejected admission document, then up at him. You work at a farm? That's right. Do much garden work? That's right. And you must be doing repairs and various upkeep around your property? Yes, that's right. Willem leaned back and looked quite pleased. Bergenworth is too, as you can assume, a property in need of upkeep, and in the process of coming through the intellectual youth. It would appear a groundskeeper slipped my mind. German looked to Lawrence, who instantly met his eyes, both arriving at the same realization. And perhaps, said the groundskeeper, with his proximity to such a place of learning, and with a pay not consisting of anything material, one could call him a scholar too. It was only then that German could see and appreciate why the sun had blessed the day with such bountiful sunlight. Osmond could not help but consider himself blessed while spying over the crowded room. He was well aware of how dull it must have appeared for the majority. Perhaps he even agreed a little, but nevertheless felt a contradictory pride in the drabness. Never before had he been around so many of his kindred minds. Would he speak to even a single one of them, he was sure a spark of friendship would surge. But the overwhelming joy of the opportunity had simply left him satisfied to remain silent for now. Some time ago, an acquaintance had peeked into his place of employment with an offer. The man doing the peeking had been Willem, who was about to establish Yarnam's very first Institute of Learning. As it were, Osmond had always been curious about the teacherly trade and, on a whim, agreed to the opportunity. Details that had surfaced later, as their bond grew more personally and professionally, concerned his position at the Institute. Willem had apparently been utterly disinterested in his teaching skills, or lack thereof, but more so of his ideals, and confessed that he needed someone willing to think outside the frames. He sat along the walls in an armchair. Others sat too, alone or in pairs. Some stood around an empty desk in the middle of the room. He began admiring the fine craftsmanship of the building's interior. It was nothing like a school or university to his mind, but a place of pure research in its state of infancy. Neat shelves of books with collected lexicons and encyclopedias of various subjects. A curved stair ran independently of the wall up from the center floor to an upper floor. It was rather dim inside, with light mostly being shed from candles, but also from windows on the upper floor that shined through the large space that gave way for the curved stair. Perhaps, he suddenly thought, with his lack of experience in mind, Byrgenwerth would be as much of a place of learning for himself as his students. It was eventually Willem himself who pierced the murmured sphere of the hall. Entering from a door on the left side, he was dressed much like the rest, standard, scholarly shirt and vest. His color scheme favored blue, but what stood out about him was the dark blue robe he wore. The sound of him opening the doors was enough to attract all attention. "A tremendous pleasure this is," he said while rubbing his hands together. "I welcome you all to Byrgenwerth. Let's not delay and begin the introduction, shall we? Please, follow me." Osmond, along with the rest, stood up and the gathering awkwardly gave way for Willem to lead the way. Although the tour would evidently start in the very room they were now in, for Willem only took a few paces inside and took position at the center desk. But now that he was standing, it felt foolish to sit once more. "Here we will explore the unknown. Here we will do the proper research to achieve the proper answers. The first principle of Byrgenwerth is that here, the masters learn alongside their students. You all come from, so many backgrounds. Some as adept teachers. We are all learned and masters at something. So, it falls to us to guide the brilliant youth as we search for answers. Our work is of a grander scale than just any of us individually. That is why we, the old, must make sure the young one day can continue our shared legacy. In addition, I personally believe the knowledge is found in unsuspecting places. Thus, you will be encouraged to work both independently, with personal projects and in collaboration, to evolve your thoughts, learning the younger minds on the way." He ended his speech, and a murmur of hushed discussion came over the attendants. A man about his own age leaned over to Osmond. "Like a dream come true, wouldn't you say? No bureaucracy businesses and narrow religious principles." Indeed." The man smiled deviously, but without any malice, and reached out a hand. "Doris, one of your new work associates." He took hold of the greeting grip. Osmond." Willem clapped with his hands assertively. "Now then, you have seen the main building. Shall we move on to the gardens?" Having not fully finished his question, he turned around and began walking towards the door on the opposite side of the room from which he had made his entry. Through the door he opened flowed the light of the sun, blinding in comparison to the dim interior. The following gathering grunted and shuffled around as they stiffly made their way, one by one, through the door Willem had disappeared through. The warm spring weather treated the garden they emerged into rightly. Smaller trees had started to bear buds, and early spring blossoms were in full bloom. A quaint, decorative little garden area. Or at least, that's how it appeared to his own uneducated mind on botanical matters. However, some acted much more impressed and swarmed over the patches of flora that came early during spring, making impressed comments to Willem about the state and contents of the garden. Rare specimens, it would appear. This is intended as a sanctuary where one calms the mind, along with the cultivation of certain flora. Worry not, you masters of the field. There are other spaces, more fit for the delicate kind of species. Moving on, then. They strolled down the stone-laid walkway in front of the main building. Along their left was the lake, gently caressing the foundation with its small motions. Willem gave pause under the large balcony. With its size in mind, it was more akin to a terrace. I adore this lake. It inspires me greatly, he remarked fleetingly, while looking out towards the distant landscape beyond the reflective surface. His attention slowly shifted over at his following. I can already see the excitement in your eyes. You all are of the curious sort, and my great ambition is that we can share camaraderie in this. I know we will bring about great things here. Now, further down lies the lecture building. Excuse me, Mr. Willem. A voice sounded just as they continued on their way. I failed to piece together these operations. I might play the fool, but I was under the impression education would play a much larger role. Oh no, not at all. Your impression serves you right. Although, that is not the purpose. Willem stopped himself and fully turned around towards them all. Our purpose is science and learning. To find truths. The students, they will be our equals here. As unfortunate as it sounds, we are too set in our ways. The first step towards evolution is to welcome in the new. If we simply were to engross ourselves in our work, as scholars are known to do, our growth will be stunned. These younger minds, though not as versed as we, will bring with them a link to new minds, to entirely new possibilities. A conventional silence ensued. It looked as if Willem caught himself in embarrassment, and he promptly turned around to continue on his way. A two-storied lecture building emerged, towering out of the forest as they left the stone-laid ground around the former building. An impressive structure certainly capable of housing research halls, lecture halls, and even dormitories. Willem stopped to point at a dome that donned the peak of the eastern wing. Our astrarium. You will know it more personally soon enough. Seeing the structure caused Osmond's jaw to slack just slightly. He had been told that Willem was a wealthy man, but what could ever be such wealth source that it could make Byrgenwerth lack in nothing, even in obscure fields such as astrology? Willem walked up and stood on the steps leading to the entrance of the building, where he turned to them. It lay just at the edge of a wide forest, with the partial structure being fully enveloped by looming oaks. Are there any questions this far? When none seemed to have any interest, Osmond braved himself.
The assembly you have here is rather diverse, and with such a range of proper equipment to boot. It all has me wondering, is there a singular goal you have in mind with the institution, Mr. Willem?
Some turned to cast him a glance, some of curiosity, some of bewilderment. Willem, however, smirked. Perceptive, indeed. Though it is much larger for simple words, I will tell you that I was once of the mindset to pursue this singular goal on my own. I found, to my dismay, very quickly might I add, that the task was very much beyond me. Thus I poured my resources to create a place like this, where we all would work towards it. I cannot unlock the truth on my own, nor could all of us. The truth in question being the great beyond, the elusive and mythical secret of the so-called eldritch truth, once touched upon by the Thumerians. Like I said, the answer is far from simple, but a journey is ahead of us, and so are the deeper answers. None seemed to have any quarrel with his sudden radicalism. Osmond knew himself to be driven by strange means at times. What did it do in the end if Willem had his peculiarities, after having given them this great gift? Carol had only returned to her old home in between studies. She thought it proper not to leave her beloved parents any unnecessary remnants of her stay. Bergenworth's first ever term was due in just a 5 days' time. While she organized her travel case with the last of her clothing, her father came and stood in the doorway. He was holding the daily paper under his arm and had a pipe in his mouth.
Dear, oh dear. What has that rascal dragged you into now?
She interrupted her packing and thought for a moment. Willem, you mean?
Of course. Never did I think he would get so many teachers this quick. To think, it's already time for the students. By the gods.
Are you not excited, father?
He let out a thick cloud that blanketed his face from the pipe, after which he took it and held it in his hand.
Oh, I am. I do worry about your studies, dear. And every other poor student. Willem always was a bit of a queer teacher.
This is not a university, father.
She closed the case.
It will more resemble my first employment.
They pay you?
No, not at first, I believe. But they provide a dorm room and research materials and everything in between.
Sounds like a student to me.
She left the foot of her bed. The trunk's lid fell close and she walked calmly over to him.
Oh, father, Willem tells it so well. His ambition. There is so much more yet to discover, and the most spectacular discoveries are mostly by accident. My education would otherwise give me a simple teaching position or archivist duties. I don't ever want to stop searching.
The look of her father told of his lack of understanding. She turned away and recovered the large suitcase. She walked over once more with some effort and placed it down at her side, facing him.
It is new, I know, but you'll see, this feels right to me. You know how concerned I have been to leave the university. This feels like a real start to something professional, and Willem is there to help me.
His face softened a bit as he looked down at her baggage.
Oh, I have faith in you. And Willem is a rather brilliant teacher. One must grant him that. There might be something to this strategy of his. I'm just concerned. You have always been so delicate. Do not let anyone take advantage of your extraordinary mind now.
She hugged him.
I won't. Don't you worry, Father. I trust Willem and his ideas. I think we will have a grand time. Madman's knowledge. Skull of a madman, touched by the wisdom of the great ones. Making contact with eldritch wisdom is a blessing, for even if it drives one mad, it allows one to serve a grander purpose for posterity.